Good afternoon. I'm Senchi, the facilitator for this webinar. Welcome to this webinar, Going Beyond Technology, Transformative Learning and e-Pedagogy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, globally, over 1.2 billion children are learning outside of physical classrooms. To minimize disruption to education, many countries are using technology as a critical communication channel and pedagogical tool during this time. While some are struggling with the basic infrastructure problems, others are concerned about the pedagogical applications of online learning in education. In Singapore, the first installment of ICT Master Plan was initiated more than 2 decades ago. We have come a long way. I'm glad that we're still thinking about making advancement in e-pedagogy. Today, we've invited 5 panel members consisting of school leader, researcher, and school teachers. The panel share their views on the transformative use of technology, knowledge co-construction, and e-pedagogy. They explain the novelty and the reality of online learning and blended learning for primary and secondary school students. They also share their experience in the innovative use of technologies in classrooms, as well as whole school design and implementation. Okay, so first of all, let me go through some housekeeping matters. If you're facing some technical issue, please email to this address. You can also join Nearpod to have synchronized viewing of the slides. The code is here. Unfortunately, we have only up to 40 participants in the Nearpod, but not to worry, because we will share screen with you. You can still see the screen. For the Q&A segment, please click on the Q&A button or icon at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions anytime, but the panel will devote about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of seminar or webinar for the Q&A. This is the rough program. I think you have already seen the slides earlier, right? Let me introduce the panel member first. We have Mr. N. Sivarajan, who is the principal of Teck Whye Secondary School, an experienced school leader with passion to generate inspiration, motivation, excitement that permeates the school. He started the Principal's Challenge in Teck Whye Secondary School, posing a monthly challenge to students so as to encourage creativity and innovative thinking in his students. Mr. Melvin Chan is a history senior teacher in Teck Whye Secondary School. He's a pedagogical leader and a committed mentor to his fellow teachers. He has written various papers exploring knowledge building pedagogy and has received numerous awards for his outstanding work. Mr. Andy Ng is the head of department of the Gifted Education Program or department at St. Hilda's Primary School. He oversees the implementation of innovative curriculum and practice and knowledge building in the school's Gifted Education Program. His work on analytics as a teaching tool has been featured in MOE Exchange newsletter and NIE's SingTeach publication. Mr. Samuel Tan is a senior specialist at ETD MOE. His research interests include effective technologies for learning, knowledge building technologies, and teacher pedagogies or practice of e-pedagogy. And Dr. Teo Chiu Lee is a senior research scientist at the Office of Education Research NIE. She is the founder of Knowledge Building Singapore, a knowledge building community for teachers who seek to mature in their understanding of knowledge building research and practice. Before I turn to the panel for discussion, I would like to interact with the audience first. So this is a set of questions that I'd like the audience to answer within 1 minute, actually. So if you are using Nearpod, okay, we have apparently more than 40 participants trying to get into Nearpod. I'm sorry, the rest of you can just look at the screen. Okay, so first set of questions coming up. So basically, this is a set of questions asking you about the type of technologies that you're using most often you're teaching. The students will be using, you're asking students to use technology as a productivity tool, A. For multimedia presentation, B. For video conferencing, C. For online assignments, D. To quiz students, E. To communicate, F. For students' collaboration, G. For students' inquiry or aspiration, H. For students to create concept maps or mind maps, I. And for students to create or produce something, J. Let's see what the audience say. We have quite a fair distribution throughout. Wow, okay, so it's now coming up more. Okay, let's look at the list here. So the top is B for multimedia presentation, followed by G for students collaboration, followed by E to quiz students, as a productivity tool for video conferencing, for students inquiry, for online assignment to communicate, for students to create something, for students to create something, and no answer last. Okay, so we can see quite a fair distribution across different tools. The arrangement of tools is such that the first 5 tools are more of learning with using from technology, and last 5 tools are learning with technologies. So let me turn to the panel and ask my first question here. For this webinar, we try not to use lecture and we try to have more conversation styles. And ask the panel first question here. Before COVID-19, during COVID-19, we've seen many examples of using technologies to mimic interactions in physical classrooms. That means to use technology to replicate or to imitate in-person teaching and learning. Is that a concern for you, panel members? Anyone can start first.
I'll start first. Andy here. So I think the one thing COVID has taught us is that learning cannot happen in the classrooms, cannot happen just in the classrooms. I think if, let's say, we use technology to just replace or replicate the classroom, we are desperately hanging on to a pre-COVID past. And for many reasons, that is not a sustainable solution. We have to invest in something that is more permanent and more pervasive. Now, for me, that is how technology can help students develop the will and the skill to construct knowledge in the classroom or not, wherever they are. So to me, that is the most important thing that we need to think about. And I think it was Churchill that said that don't waste a good crisis. And I think we shouldn't waste this one either. We need to rethink how we use technology in the future classroom, which may not even be a classroom anymore.
Thanks, Andy. Anybody else?
Maybe I'll continue from here.
I'm Melvin.
Yes, yeah, I'm Melvin here. I think this also, just like what Andy mentioned, I also reminded of a quote by, I think, Michael Fullen in one of his position paper. All content on the new platform is still old content. Using old pedagogies with new technologies did not necessarily enable powerful learning. So I think this certainly reminds most of us, also at least from myself, the few models that we have in mind, the SAMR model, substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition in terms of technology integration, and also the TPEC framework I think most of us are quite familiar with. I think generally all this reminded us that transformative learning itself occurs when technology is never used in isolation, but is used in close connection with pedagogy, disciplinarity, and education domains. So maybe just let me share a bit more. I think so. In order to have a technology-enabled learning itself, I believe that it comes back to the idea of rethinking the entire learning experience for our students. With 2 key elements, I think will help us a lot. That is the well-being and the quality learning. If you take a look at the screen by itself for now, I think first and foremost that it will be a hybrid experience that we need to create for students to really have a sense of autonomy, the idea of choice, the sense of relatedness, the idea of connections, and the sense of competency. And particularly, if you ask me for in terms of home-based learning or in terms of online learning itself, I think the idea of relatedness is even more critical because we really can't see them, and yet we need to connect with them. So with this idea in mind, I think you take a look at the screen by itself. Last year, in order to get our class with my colleagues together, to where our class get connected, where they even have a sense of competency and also maybe to be able to embrace diverse learning by itself. All our students itself are involved in the creation of a class special projects via online, such as a class circuit breaker diary, where they introduce different activities per day to interact with their family at home, where they have a class pamphlet to think of activities for students during the holidays, and also our class interdisciplinarity project, where they were able to link different subjects together with the title called The Beauty of Something. You can scan a QR code to have access to all these materials by itself. I think through them, it allows our students itself to connect with one another beyond the allocated timing, and more importantly, it allows us to have a more pocket of time to interact with them, where we'll do an authentic task together. Yeah, so I think the most optimally that indeed we cannot just replicate a physical classroom. We need to rethink the entire learning experiences, where connect them both in school situated and also on the online platform. Thank you.
Thanks. I like the way that Andy talked about beyond classroom, imagine beyond classroom. So I think during the COVID, we have this experience that we're thrown into the deep sea about online learning, right? Some of us are not prepared. Some of us are more prepared. So we need to think about a new model in which I think blended learning is probably the term to use, beyond physical classroom, but tapping on both physical and cyberspace. And Melvin talked about holistic learning experience, students' well-being plus quality learning, sense of competence, sense of relatedness, as well as sense of autonomy. And these are very interesting ideas. I wonder whether other panel members have any other opinion to share?
Yeah, maybe I just jump in here. I think as a school leader, right, one of the thoughts that really occupies my mind all the time is that our students are really heading out into a world that is going to be very different, where they've got to learn to be self-directed and learners for the future. So John Hattie's work on visible learning, right, where teachers actually see through the eyes of the student and then help them become their own learners. I think that part, what kind of pedagogies really support this, right, and in the classroom, and how can the affordances of technology be used to do this? Because as we go into putting a PLD in the hands of every child alone, that alone is not going to be enough. We need to think beyond just giving them a device to what kind of pedagogies, how are we going to be teaching in the classroom? So that really occupies my mind. And I think this part about getting our students to be self-directed learners, and how do we really make, how do teachers actually see through the eyes of the students, and get them to become their own teachers? That's really something I feel has shifted, and something that has made us really sit up and think deeper about this. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Siva. I think we talked about PLD, a personal learning device. This is one initiative for those of participants who are not Singaporean. This is one of the initiatives that is going to be rolled to all schools, at least all secondary school in the next 2 years. Students will be getting their personal devices. And what Mr. Siva is saying is it's not just the device itself, but we need to think about the pedagogies. And he mentioned about self-directed learning, for instance, that how do we help the students to be able to direct their own learning, to manage their own learning, to plan for their own learning. And I think several speakers also talk about some of these pedagogical issues. I wonder whether Samuel, Julie, do you have any view on this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just built on what Mr. Siva has just said, because I remembered during the COVID-19 time, when it was locked down, and as researcher also had to collect data differently. So I was online watching the online discussion on Knowledge Forum and students posting ideas. And I actually, throughout my years of watching students working on KF, I thought just what Andy was saying, don't waste the crisis. I thought that was the moment that I realized that when students were working from home and without the immediate interaction with teachers and all the instructions that were coming their way, I saw a flourish of ideas. So that was really a moment kind of aha moment for me. And I think without even thinking whether whether we need to change the way we interact with the student during a different, when the environment and culture and the time and pacing, everything change, the students were showing us what they were capable of doing. So I just want to add on that point, and because of that, we thought during the lockdown time, Knowledge Forum, the online discourse, would have no chance of surviving the crisis, but instead teachers were becoming very interested in it as a new way of interacting. They felt that they needed to give students some space, and they needed to know students thought in different ways. So I just want to share that period of time when I actually saw this happening, and it was very heartening. Yeah. Sam, pass to you.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so I think we have, I like the ideas that have been brought up. I think, this situation put us in a position where we can look at the opportunity that it presents. So Julie talked about, how we actually, how students were actually thinking about and putting down their thoughts to connect ideas. Possibly like not what we have not seen previously. And I think it's a good reminder, at least for me, when we think about this is a very naturalistic environment where the technology actually allows students to connect ideas and to think deeply. And they are in an environment where, they have some freedom to initiate or to have some agency to choose, like what Melvin was saying, providing a choice, and to decide in some way, what else to learn, why do I need to find out more about a particular topic. So this sense of openness and agency, but actually is quite deliberate, right? So I think that when I look at the way that teachers design the learning, I think these kinds of interactions where the students actually can have to reflect, have to think about how to move forward. I think these are really important design elements that the teacher actually builds into the lesson. So I wanted to say that this is I think what we can see from some of the deliberate design of teachers during this period, and something to take away, that when we look at other modes of learning, like what Xingqi was saying, maybe blended learning, we also think about how these learning interactions that we build in an online environment, or in this case a knowledge forum, can actually build certain new competencies for students, like how they handle knowledge, how they work together collaboratively to improve ideas. So these are some things that are very exciting possibilities that we know have been there, but I think this crisis or this situation has highlighted it and brought it into sharper focus for me, at least. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I'd like to present these two scenarios here. I think on one hand, if you think this as a constraint, okay, COVID-19 forces us to do online learning, to teach through a computer platform. That's a constraint. If you see that as a constraint, and then you try to mimic the in-person teaching, what would you do? You try to control, right? You try to control what is happening. You try to control every student on the screen. So we saw examples of some teachers actually have two devices. One just to look at all the students' faces to make sure that they're paying attention, or at least they're staring at the screen, okay? And the other one for teaching and learning interaction. So we're trying very hard to mimic the kind of in-person interactions. And if students are keeping quiet, okay, what do? You get very agitated. And I also heard stories like, P1 kids, when they're at home, so they do not listen to teachers as much, right? So they have all the freedom at home. So they'll bring their toys and then share in front of the camera. They talk to bring their siblings, and all sorts of interesting things happen that we never seen before. Okay, so seeing that as a constraint, okay, that brings us a lot of challenges, obstacles. But on the other hand, I hear a lot of opportunities here. The word opportunity is very important here. Opportunities for what? Opportunities that we can actually think about connecting students in the authentic environment at home, for instance? Okay, what can they bring from the home environment to the class? Authentic experience, connectivity about students. Okay, so these are very important ideas that we can think about, like what Chili mentioned. Okay, we thought that self-directed learning students bring the ideas to the class is something that is not achievable, but during this COVID time, it's actually even more conducive to this kind of idea. I wonder what the panel have. Any further opinion to share on this?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you can
just want to
just
build on quickly. Sorry, I just want to build on quickly to what the example that Xingqi was giving, and just a note of encouragement, because I was working with a group of preschool teachers during the lockdown, and they were working with 5 years old, 6 years old in an online environment. And I had this teacher who, after experiencing the professional development of teachers also changed, right? So they were on this knowledge forum, figuring out how the ideas of the children is going to get connected. And she actually started to use an online mind map to capture what the children were sharing with her in an online environment. And after the whole lockdown, what we did was to print out that online mind map, brought it back to the classroom, and the young children could actually see that, teacher, this idea we need to work on a little bit more. So after the COVID-19 lockdown, we actually see this as a poster on the wall. So I think the opportunity is just great. I just thought of this example what Xingqi mentioned. Yeah. Andy, I'll pass the time to you.
Yeah, if I can just add on another story, because I know that there's a lot of stories, and I think it's good for us to bring it out and to learn from these stories. So I think firstly, to have a preamble, I think we have to remember that this generation of students, they are digital natives. They are digital natives. To them, being at a computer, being in the cyberspace, it's their natural setting, is the natural setting. In fact, I think most of, if you have children, probably they spend much more time on a digital space than in the physical space. So with this profile in mind, how then can we cater to these students? Sometimes I think Dr. Teo and Samuel, you guys hit the nail on the head, because you all said, really, teachers, maybe we're just getting started and we get out of the way. We get out of the way and have that faith in students that they can have the will and the skill to perhaps build that knowledge, to construct that knowledge. And this is ultimately linked to the idea of student agency, something that I think OECD is looking at. Student agency, how do we promote student agency in future ready learners? And this is not just an ideal, like idealistic setting, idealistic goal that we, it's just in our imagination. It's rather pragmatic as well. And here's the story that I like to share. I think during the home-based learning, during the lockdown in Singapore, as a department head, I conducted a midterm review. Halfway through the home-based learning, I conducted a midterm review. And it was quite heart-wrenching to see how teachers actually try to spend so much time in preparing their lessons. We did a rather quantitative survey, and teachers on average in my own department spend about 3.5 hours just on a single lesson, one lesson, and they might have 2 or 3 lessons in the course of a day. They spend 3.5 hours just trying to curate every single part of the lesson so that it looks exactly the same as the physical lesson. And how many hours they burnt trying to control. And like what Dr. Tan Xingqi mentioned, if we can just release this control to students and believe in them, perhaps it's even more pragmatic for teachers as well. And we see them flourish, as Dr. Teo mentioned, when this agency is given to them.
Okay, I'm looking at some of the questions coming in here. I know it's not the Q&A time yet, but they look relevant to what we're discussing right now. So I'm just going to point out one question here. So one question asks about students coping with self-directed learning. What's the view about this? So in this particular question, it's talking about students not coping well with self-directed learning and having a depression because of that. So what can we do to help the students with self-directed learning? Any view on that?
Yeah, maybe
learning.
it's okay. Andy, you want to take? Okay, maybe just a quick view on this. I think that is exactly why we need to start from primary, secondary school and all to get our children to learn in a self-directed manner. And I think self-directed learning itself is a process, and it's not we want the student to be a self-directed learner, but I think it's a process. And so how we set up age appropriate learning at every stage of their lives will lead there. Being a father of a JC going child myself, I can say actually last year during the COVID period, in fact, the children were a bit down. And I think they're very much used to the social interactions in class, being able to just reach across to a friend and just have it answered, or a teacher to be able to point out where they're going and all. So when they were left to deal with this alone, yes, it does add to the stress. It's a real thing that we should not be looking away from. And that is why like what Melvin was doing, like setting up a class supportive kind of like an environment where they can easily ask questions, do things and all is helpful. And the other part is that we need to do this as they are growing up, so that they don't come to a time where they're going to be feeling pressed, especially when they are in JC or preparing for A levels or for a major exam. Yeah.
To build on to Mrs. Siva's point, I think at the core of self-directed learning is motivation. If one is intrinsically motivated, I think self-directed learning would be rather smooth if motivation is there. So I think the bigger question is, how do we build that motivation in students? What kind of pedagogy builds that intrinsic motivation in students? I mean, in MOE circles, we talk about the joy of learning, but we know that joy of learning is not just happiness and all that, but perhaps curiosity, and perhaps sometimes even productive confusion. How do we allow students to desire knowledge? And if they have that motivation, then self-directed learning might not be such a big issue.
Thanks, Andy. I think I heard also the word agency earlier, okay, from Samuel and from several panel speakers. I think the important part of this motivation is actually agency as well. The students have the agency to pursue what they want to pursue. Certain questions that they want to ask, not just from the textbook, but questions that they discover in their life, that they feel around the environment. They look at what the teachers are teaching and compare what they're experiencing. So if they can pursue those questions, ask those questions, and get the answer, I think those are important ways of encouraging students' agency and self-directed learning. And self-directed learning is also a spectrum, right? That you can actually scaffold the students through different stages of self-directed learning. It's not a yes, no, self-directed learning versus no self-directed learning, but more a spectrum that we can slowly scaffold the students towards. And there's also one comment that during the COVID period, this person also found that the teachers are actually collaborating more. And I believe this is something that Dr. Teo Chew Lee was alluding to as well, that she saw teachers collaborating more, at least in the preschool that she was following. Teachers are actually collaborating more. We saw also on Facebook that teachers actually join certain groups and then they start sharing many useful ideas and interesting ideas. So these are really something very heartening. And I think, well, feel free to keep your questions coming. We will still have a Q&A sessions near the end of this webinar. But as and when there are relevant questions, I will just point to those questions. Other questions we may not answer right now, but we'll answer nearer to the end of the webinar. So I think several panel members talk about knowledge forum, knowledge building, and transformative use of technologies. And I would like to ask more about this. What exactly is knowledge building? How is knowledge building different from learning? So I'd like to turn to the panel members, ask for you to share a few examples. Before that, we'll show a short clip of video about Knowledge Forum. This is to give a context of what Knowledge Forum looks like, so that I can understand the presentation better. And this video clip was prepared by and D. Just give me a minute, I'll share the video. Okay, how do I share screen? Okay.
This is a knowledge forum view. This is the lesson prompt. In this case, it is a question that anchors the entire discussion for all the students. It can be typed out as a post or uploaded as an image file. In this case, this is an image file that's created and uploaded as background for this view. There are also clusters of discussion. Here we see a big cluster of discussion, and here a smaller one. Now, this big cluster starts from this student over here. How we know this is because of these arrows. These blue arrows are automatically created when a student comments on another student's posts. So we see the different arrows that are gravitating towards this original post. Now, how do students discuss? It's using a unique feature in Knowledge Forum called the sentence starters. When students click on this button to post, they will be shown these sentence starters. These sentence starters are related to suggesting an idea, to maybe get students to elaborate on the idea, or students can add on to another idea, or respectfully disagree. They can also make connections between ideas and conclude ideas. Lastly, they can also take reflective stances on the discussion. So how this works is that a student clicks on a sentence starter and types down his or her idea and clicks contribute. For students, these sentence starters over here act as scaffolds for their thinking. According to the flow of the discussion, students choose the appropriate sentence starters to frame their thinking. Do they want to propose an idea? Do they need to provide new information, clarify, or perhaps take a more reflective stance? This thinking about how they think is related to metacognition. For teachers, both the content of the student's idea and their metacognition is made visible from students' choice of sentence starters. Let's take a look at one cluster of discussion to see this in action. Now over here in this cluster, we see this is the original post over here. So it's fully visible to teachers. And we see that this student over here has chosen to use this scaffold, I believe. And it gives a sense to the teacher that this, the contents of this post will probably be a belief that the student has instead of a fact or a justified opinion, perhaps just a preliminary idea. Over here, below, we see that this student has built on to the original idea. And if we click on it, we see that this student has used yet another scaffold to guide her thinking. And by just looking at this scaffold, I can add on, it gives a sense to the teacher that perhaps this student agrees with the original post and wants to add on an idea, add on an example, add on a suggestion to further buttress the original point. Over here, we see another post replying and building on to the original one. And conversely, another student over here uses another scaffold I'm not sure about. So just from this scaffold, we get a sense that this student will probably not fully agree with the original post and would perhaps suggest another alternative idea or something to differ from the original post. We see that the original student over here has commented on the post that disagrees with him and uses yet another scaffold which shows a more reflective stance. So over here, he writes, we need better ideas about. So he's taking a step back and using the collective of we, as in both of us, we're engaging on this discussion. And so we need better ideas about, in this case, implementation. So from the sentence starters, we see students' choice of how they're thinking vis-a-vis the other options of thinking. For this student, he chose to think using a belief mode instead of saying that he knows something. For this student, why did she choose to add on to buttress a particular point instead of connecting or conclude. This student chose to differ from an opinion. And why did he choose this instead of using the other thinking modes? So all this is visible to the teacher, and the questions can be posed to students to perhaps explain their choice of thinking, how they're thinking, metacognition.
Thanks. There's also a video to promote the KB community that Shirley is leading. Okay, with that video, to explain what is Knowledge Forum, I'd like to invite the panel members to share more about your understanding about knowledge building the pedagogy. Who's going first? Melvin?
Sure. Hi. Yeah. I think I will introduce knowledge for building in a very succinct way by itself. At least for myself, the teacher work with together. I think it's very, if we sum up very nicely, within the heart of knowledge building is basically the idea of always improving, always ideating together. Okay, I think that sums up the importance of collectiveness itself, where we are connected, we are participating together to rise above our current knowledge that we have. Yeah, so I think that's the idea of knowledge building, if you ask me. Okay, and maybe I think in response to your earlier question in terms of transformative use of technology itself, okay, I think one of the, similar to what Andy has shown in the video itself, I think one of the affordance of learning analytics itself, if you take a look at the slide itself, I think I love the part where, just like what Andy, the video mentioned, the scaffold trackers, together with scaffold trackers, with the ideas building network, okay, I think if you take a look on the right side itself, it allows me to do the following thing. Okay, first, I'm able to recognize my students or they themselves able to recognize their learning patterns, whether how do they learn, how do they work, are they really a collaborator or are they just a consumer? These are questions for us to, based on the data itself, we immediately gather from there. The students, they're able to reflect on their own. After they're recognizing, they're able to reflect further on whether, what's my thoughts from this data? Are there any consideration I need to take on account of? For example, maybe this time around because certain content, or is it because certain context, or maybe is it maybe because of my confidence level itself? So this helps us to reflect. And last but not least, but more importantly, I think it's a part where they are ready to use and adjust the learning patterns based on the data given to them, where they're able to think, do I need to change? And if so, how do I plan to do so? So I think this is one of the affordance of technology in this particularly knowledge forum that allows the student to see the learning patterns and able to adjust, modify accordingly, which I believe certainly one of the key features of what self-directed learner to be like. And ultimately, it really made, as what the video mentioned itself, it made the entire learning process, the entire learning itself to be visible itself. Yeah, so I see this. I see this one of more of the transformative use of technology itself.
Thanks, Melvin. Anyone wants to add to that? Andy?
Yeah, I think Melvin explained it perfectly actually for knowledge building. The heart of it is students' ideas and how teachers can partner students in that ideation. So maybe I'll explain it in a different way to build on to the explanation. So to me, knowledge building, or KB, is explained when we compare it against what is not knowledge building. What is not knowledge building? So an explanation by maybe referring to a negative example. So we know that perhaps what is in our education system right now is a lot of knowledge acquisition. So traditional classroom, we try our best to come up with a lot of ways for students to remember things. We use like acronym.
Andy, your video is freezing.
All these things
Sorry.
that I spent. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can
So
hear
you
me?
were talking about
Okay, great.
knowledge
Sorry.
building versus acquisition of knowledge. Can you rewind back to the part?
Sure. Sorry about that. So I was saying that we use all means and ways for students to remember knowledge and to hopefully retain them forever. So I was saying that we use like acronyms, we use like mind maps, or sometimes even songs for students to remember that. But my question is that sometimes if let's say that students grow up and they look back, and would they think that, hey, why did I spend so much effort to remember this knowledge when now it's obsolete? It's obsolete. That knowledge that I spent so much time and effort to acquire and retain is obsolete. It's no longer of use to me. So that is my question. And knowledge building, on the other hand, it's not about purely just acquiring knowledge. It's a byproduct. It's a byproduct of it. But the main thing of it is the students having the will and the skill to construct that knowledge by themselves. That is more precious in a knowledge building setting. And to maybe link back to Melvin's point on the teacher's role. So the teacher's role in knowledge building is really to partner the students and to create a safe space for diverse ideas to emerge, rally students to improve on these ideas, and then together with the students to assess and converge on ideas that are promising. And it's sustainable. It's sustainable because these processes will go on for eternity, no matter maybe 10 years later on, as long as you're working with ideas, 20 years on, it will be the same process. And so if we can start them young, start the knowledge building process young, perhaps this is something more permanent and pervasive that we want to invest ourselves in.
Thanks, Andy. I think connecting to what you said when you answered the first question about extending beyond classrooms, I think this is one good example in which we use students' idea, capture it somewhere, there's permanence to the idea, students' idea, that you can revisit the ideas again, and that should go beyond the four walls of the classrooms, and they can go to the forum, revisit the forum, revisit some of the students' questions, and then answer them. So, and if you have a way to keep the idea for life, they can actually visit it for life, right? So I think that is one very good example. And also several of you mentioned about making learning visible. I think Mr. Siva mentioned that. So it's Andy and Melvin, making learning visible, making thinking visible, making metacognition visible. I think those are illustrated through these examples.
If I can contribute to build on Andy's point, in the sense that beyond just the ideas that they gather, right, or the knowledge that they gather, what kind of a disposition, a thinking disposition, do we want the child to have throughout their years as they go through school? So it's always, we think about this, like at our school, we have a vision of a community of design thinkers. So we want the students to be design thinkers, and it just doesn't mean solving a problem at that point or going through a particular project in school and then just making use of the design thinking process and then coming up with the product. But how do we, beyond the projects that they do and all, through the daily classroom experience, how do they develop how do we cultivate a certain mindset, give them a meta frame through which that when they go through their years and they get out of the formal school system, that they will still be able to use that as a frame. So I think in knowledge forum or knowledge building, the pedagogy itself, I think there's this continuous effort to improve and to ideate, to look for solutions, which is actually the essence of design thinking in the first place. So I think that's the power or the value of that process of learning, rather than just the knowledge itself. That's how I see, in terms of what happens in the daily classroom experience. I think it's important. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Siva. I like the way that you bring design thinking. In fact, I think the pioneer for this knowledge building pedagogy did talk about that as well, drawing inspiration from the ideal group. And the two are very close. So design thinking talk about designing physical artifacts. You improve the physical artifacts to solve a real world problem. And knowledge building talks about designing knowledge artifacts we produce knowledge artifacts to improve our understanding. So the two are very similar, except that the nature of the artifacts can be slightly different. In knowledge building, there's nothing stopping us also to come up with physical artifacts as well. So those are very important ideas. Truly, as the leader of the knowledge building community in Singapore, do you have any other experience to share about knowledge building?
Yeah, I'm part of the community, not a leader, but just to build on to what Mr. Silva had said about community of design thinkers and what you're making me think about design thinking and knowledge building. I think knowledge building has always been that environment, the culture that can be pervasive to the child in and out of the school. And recently, thinking about it as a habit of thinking, as a way of doing things. I mean, I remembered my earlier years working with Melvin. I went to his history class. The first question he said for his students were, why are we learning pre-Singapore before 1819? And it was not what is it about, it was why. Is it important for us to deal with a history of Singapore that is so distant from us? And when the students started talking, I found that some of them were agreeing that that was an important part to learn. Some of them were not. Some of them think that it's too far off. And even with that, I think yesterday we had another separate discussion of readiness. I think the readiness that we use in differentiated instruction, right? I think such questions to start off can be a way of really assessing how ready students are in going into history discussion and so on. Of course, I'm not a history expert, so I won't go into that. But I see such a broader frame of culture and environment that could really get people to think about idea improvement and what's useful for our students. And so, following the story of Melvin's history class, the students started to talk about opium. So instead of using the normal way, he was using what students were interested and really guiding the way. So I saw a group of students who knew what they know, but they also knew what they didn't know at that point of time. And they kind of have a bigger sense of why are we studying this part of history. And I think it resonates with what the team is talking about. So, in our effort to work on knowledge forum and work on learning analytics, I think the bigger frame of the culture, the environment, the habits of thinking that we want to instill in our children and students are really important. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. So I think from her example, we know that actually many teachers are doing idea improvement in the classroom. So without technology, you can still do idea improvement in classroom. And this is something that's very precious. We think very important learning experience for students with or without technology. Samuel, from your perspective, you have visited many schools. What's your take on knowledge building?
Yeah. Thanks. So I think, building on the earlier points, I mean, Julie pointed out that this whole idea that, we are helping the way that students perceive how knowledge is created. And we think of knowledge building as a way of thinking or an approach to thinking that that our students are developing through their processes. I think this is something that that really resonates with me. I think as they, the idea improvement process is one that we can see students developing a certain, not just the skills to work with new knowledge and to accept some level of ambiguity and to work with it, but also how they relate to others, to other people's ideas, how they make use of those ideas. So I think we can see that, teachers, when teachers actually design with these intentions in mind, it shows in their lessons. So, if the teacher is meaning to allow their students to generate ideas, but not just generate ideas around a problem, but also to improve those ideas. And that is part of their pedagogy. And so this is something that I am encouraged when I look at teachers looking at it from this perspective. You know, they're trying to build this as a way of thinking, a disposition in the students, the way that they work with knowledge, the way they understand knowledge. So it's something that I think we can commend teachers for doing, but we also want to encourage more of such design thinking on the part of teachers to enable students to take part in such a learning experience. Yeah.
Thanks. Now turning to some of the questions in the Q&A. One question asked about how can teachers detect early that a student is not able to keep up with online lessons with self-directed learning. So I think since you talk about analytics in Knowledge Forum, would some of you be able to, some panel members be able to answer this question?
Maybe allow me to come in for a while.
Sure.
Yeah, I think currently I'm working with Dr. Teo and a few of us too in terms of the idea of curriculum mapping, where we have one layer of student discourse together with another layer of where we map up the curriculum keywords. Then we will see whether the student achieves certain levels in terms of their understanding of the concept or the content itself. So I believe that's a power of the learning analytics, where we're able to detect students on where they are and how do we progress from there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'll just share an anecdote that I saw in a preschool, and I'll come back to the main point and building on Melvin also. Like so the preschool, the 4 years old are seated around and they are talking about a certain topic on building, and this child was trailing away for whatever reason. So the preschool teacher stood up, asked the child to come to her, and her first question was, do you want to know what the class are doing? Do you want to be part of the project? Instead of why are you like that? So I'm kind of, I mean, it's a short episode, but it kind of made me think that what the learning analytics on Knowledge Forum has been doing was to get the children to look at it and say that Andy does it very well. He has this scaffold tracker and he would say that, okay, this is what we are doing now. There's so much of my theory. There's so little of this theory doesn't explain. He just left it and think about what we are doing and what we are not doing enough. And half an hour later, the scaffold tracker is bound to change, right? So I think there are real problems when students fail away. I'm not trivializing it. But if we can use, because knowledge building focus on two things. One, it focuses on really the agency of the children. But second, it focus on the socializing. So why don't we capitalize, and the learning analytics precisely does that. It makes a student think about, hey, what the class are doing and how can I do a bit more? Even the curriculum analytics that Melvin are talking about, we position it as, hey, the JC students have all these words that you are not using. Would there be some, so the children naturally say that, hey, maybe there are words that we could look up. And so they start to look up on words that seemingly are important to the JC. So I kind of turn this problem around to be, let the students be motivated enough to be part of the discourse. Of course, like what Mr. Siva earlier alluded, it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. But if you persist in a certain way of interacting and persist in using those phrases that we encourage our students, like, hey, I never thought of that. Could you say more? You know, it takes time to build this culture. But we as we see more explicitly in our preschool, we have fewer and fewer students trailing away, even with the 3 years old and 4 years old. I kept mentioning that because their actions is very obvious. You go into a class, you know whether the child is with you or not. The older kids, sometimes they look like they are with you, but they are not. You know, so the younger children give you a very immediate response. So I thought to add on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. I think if you look at this analytics here, this is the students' interaction here. So if you see a student here at one corner here, not interacting with other students, you know that this student is probably not participating, and you can probably look at the students and ask the students, check with students what's happening. Okay? So I think these are some ways in which you can use the analytics to help us with the technology to help us. And I think what the panel is also saying is that this need not be done just by the teachers. This analytics is available to the students so that they can be self-directed even in assessing their own participation. Okay. There are several questions related to what we're talking about this segment, during this segment. One of the questions is very interesting. Obviously, this person has probably taken a course with us before. So the question is about learning metaphors, what Andy talked about earlier also. Okay. Whether knowledge forum or knowledge building can be used to acquire knowledge, to obtain relevant knowledge that's accurate yet succinct. Any view on that?
Maybe I can add on to that, because that is definitely a key question when it comes to teachers. Teachers are very practical creatures. So we definitely want students to take away something, but how do we guide students to that process? What structure do we put in? That is maybe a question for us to think about. So if Prof. Tan, can you shift to the slide on the hard copy knowledge building? So I think it's a few slides down. Yes, this one. Yes, that's right. So the previous slide, sorry.
No, I think it's the one. Yeah, I think he's lagging. This is the one, okay. I'm guessing.
The mahjong paper one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, this is the one. So this is not my practice. This is something that I saw in the teacher's classroom, and it's really brilliant and answers the question perfectly. So over here we see this is a hard copy version. So before students even get onto knowledge forum, the technology, we hope that they can actually have that culture and that etiquette of knowledge building first. So this includes, like, let's say, using the right language, using the facilitative language in order to build knowledge together. So on the right, you see, we see that these are knowledge building cards. So over here, if we take a closer look, these are sentence starters. So students can use particular cards to explain their thinking by using the sentence starter, I think, or they can use other sentence starters reflecting their choice of thinking. So on the left, we see the mahjong paper, the butcher paper. And this teacher's practice is really interesting. They start off with 4 students at the corners of the table, and the clouds over there, the little clouds, represent their own view. And as you can see, afterwards, then there comes the interesting bit, which is all the build-ons. So we see different build-ons over here. We see students proposing better ideas. We see students clarifying different thoughts, and even an interesting question that comes up. This is a science lesson. So one student even asked, how is heat trapped? How is heat trapped? So all these ideas are coming around. And the key question that I think the participant raised, which is a very good question, is how do we consolidate everything together? How do students consolidate things together? So this teacher has a very interesting practice, which is I can direct your attention to the center of the butcher paper. That's where she gets students to put their ideas together. And as a group, how can they conclude their discussion? So the students have to rack their brains and thinking, okay, take a look at our discussion. What are we discussing? What exactly are we discussing? Where are we going? And summarize that idea in a small bubble right in the middle there, to have something like a checkpoint to see, okay, this is our conclusion for now. And this, I think, is this teacher's practice of presenting the students, or getting the students to present their own knowledge succinctly, and what is accurate or not, that's where the teacher comes in. That's where a teacher comes in to maybe take a look at all the different groups and have some pedagogical interventions if, let's say, there are some alternative conceptions here and there. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. I think what Andy has described is the process of students getting to that knowledge, understanding, and capture that in the process of discussion, in collaboration. What's also important is to realize why are we acquiring knowledge? So I think in the more traditional sense, we teach the students a certain topic. We hope they can acquire the knowledge, and then we give them practice questions that they can apply. In knowledge for building, the students are acquiring the knowledge to answer certain questions. So it's not acquiring knowledge for the sake of acquiring knowledge, but acquiring knowledge to answer certain questions. And these questions mainly come from them. So in order to answer those questions, they have to have accurate knowledge first. So in the process of discussion, they sharpen their understanding of certain topic. So I would say Carl Breiter is also one of the pioneers of knowledge building. He said knowledge building is beyond learning. And it took me a long time to understand what he was trying to say. Basically, we're not just learning about something for the sake of learning about something, but we use our knowledge to solve some problems. Problem of understanding the world, problem of trying to solve some problems. Okay, but regardless, we're using that piece of knowledge in a certain way. So for knowledge building, we acquire knowledge. We have to acquire knowledge, but that does not end there. We use that knowledge for something else, to solve a real world problem, okay, to make our understanding better. So I think that's the main difference here. Okay, there are a couple of questions related to knowledge building and emotions, which is very interesting topic. We can tackle it now or we can tackle it later on. Maybe we'll keep it KIV first. I would like to maybe proceed with the next question for the panel. Okay. After listening to knowledge building, it sounds like, well, I've been doing it for many years by now, and I've been teaching about this for many years by now. And most of the questions that I get when students or when participants first hear about this is, well, this cannot work in Singapore classrooms. Okay. This is a fantasy. Are you sure it can work? So I'd like to turn to the panel members. Many of you are school teachers, MOE officers. I've been school teachers before. Truly was a school teacher before. We all have our own experience of running knowledge building in schools. So I'd like to turn to the panel member and ask you, how do you make it work in your classroom or in your schools?
Maybe I paint a broad picture from a school-wide perspective. Actually, I feel that not enough of research translates to classroom practice. I think we give up too quickly. And I think practitioners need to work alongside researchers to first, I think, understand and answer questions, of the phenomenon that they observe in classroom. For example, why are students not motivated? How come they can't retain the what we just taught them? They keep forgetting. So I think as teachers, we observe certain things in the classroom, but to answer those questions, right, to understand what's happening, I think we can work alongside researchers. One of the things. The other thing is that we can help to improve the design of the technological tools. So if let's say it's knowledge forum, and I think there were some questions on like, how do we know what the students are feeling or thinking, at that particular moment? So if let's say this is what we observe in the classroom, then working alongside people who are designing these technological tools, right? To say maybe you need an emoticon to actually pop up when they are, great idea, or like I'm excited about this, rather than having to click to go and see maybe an emoticon. I'm not sure I'm not sure of the technology behind this, but I'm just saying that it's something like that. So personally, for me, I think schools need to become some sort of a learning lab. Some sort of like National University Hospital, so something like the NTU teaching school, so that we take what's working, what we are finding out in terms of research and real practice on the ground, and then really working alongside others to make it, try it out in our classrooms and make it happen. So I think it must be that belief of doing so, which then starts off the whole any other thing that we can do. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Siva. So Mr. Siva was talking about working alongside with researchers. Of course, a teacher as researcher, many of you are very qualified researchers as well in schools, right? How about teachers? What's your view about how to make it happen in your classrooms?
Maybe allow me a bit on from Mr. Siva's conversation itself. Can you hear me?
Yes, Melvin, yes.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think maybe you can show the slide that I mentioned earlier, I prepared earlier. I think there are three things to make it successful, or maybe to make it more meaningful and productive itself. I think if you take a look at the slide, I think the first portion itself is the idea to be well versed in your subject disciplinarity and the necessary pedagogy. I think that is part where also Mr. Siva mentioned earlier. Here, we can work alongside with researchers to be able to deepen our knowledge of pedagogies too. So I think the well-versed portion is very important. If you take a look at the below well-versed, you see a shopping bag. What does that suggest? I think it's very interesting. I was having a class, I think a few weeks ago, at least a few weeks ago, where they started to venture into the history of paper bags in Nazi Germany. It's not the syllabus, okay, but I think it's very interesting that from here you're able to venture into propaganda, into living environment, and even ask the question whether does it apply to current situation or whatever it is accordingly. I thought it's very interesting. I think we had never imagined that shopping bag could be the trigger to be the entire lesson on Nazi Germany by itself. Again, it comes back to how we are well versed in subject disciplinarity to link them up together, the idea connection. I think besides the be well versed, I think the next portion itself is for us really to be well accustomed with the community of practitioners. That means to work together with our fellow colleagues, work together with the researchers, everything along the way, so that we can able to see things in a much more bigger macro holistic view, as what Dr. Teo mentioned itself, the idea of opium. Okay, I think together with my colleagues, that's when we realized that the idea of opium can be a very good a platform for them to understand the entire British Singapore itself. And recently, I got one class mentioned about the idea of, can we explore the history of haircuts? Again, it's very creative thoughts from the students. Is that really the interest to explore on haircuts? I have no idea of what is the haircut history of Singapore by itself or the barber by itself. Okay, but from here, we started to realize that it can really integrate occupational history together with the broader social and political history of British Singapore by itself. So I think that's a part where the community comes in to help to level each other up. And last but not least, I think I love this portion itself, what was mentioned by all the presenters earlier, the idea of be welcoming in having a principle-based classroom. So what are the principle that we want to see in our classroom by itself? I think in our Take 1 itself, particularly for our Take 1 Head Knowledge Building class, we have the 3 C's, where we stress the idea of centrality of student voices, that means student agency, student ideas coming on board, the idea of culture of build on, where they constantly help each other to fine-tune, develop the ideas. And last but not least, the cost of rising above, as what Andy mentioned earlier, the question stamps that helps them to be able to push the boundary and the frontier by itself. So this just generally these are 3 W's that I have in mind that really makes the entire KB not a fantasy, but really a reality that can be carried out in the classroom context itself.
Thanks, Melvin. I like your 3C. Okay. Students' voice, build on, and rising above. Yes. Andy, how about you? What's your experience?
I really like Mrs. Siva's point on working together with researchers. Okay, I'll be honest. In my experience, we have worked a lot. We've worked with researchers a lot. And why ultimately I invested my department with knowledge building is really because I'm just going to say it, of Dr. Teo, because of Dr. Teo. So many times when we work with researchers, it's a one-way conversation. It's a one-way conversation. Researchers present a particular ideal that they hope to see in the class, and the class is a data point for them. How Dr. Teo approaches it is a bit different. In fact, it's actually very different. There's a co-construction involved. When Dr. Teo, I think being a school teacher, understands the constraints in the classroom. And therefore, when there's this ideation process, she and her team really co-construct the lesson with the teachers and ultimately travels, journeys together with the teachers and the students all the way to the end. And it's not a one-way conversation, it's a dialogue. It's a constant dialogue, even to the end, where the teacher ultimately feels that, hey, actually, I learned a lot from this process, instead of me just providing the data for the researcher to maybe write a paper on. So there's this dialogue, and it's a constant conversation. So maybe I can present a perspective, both from a teacher's perspective as well as from a middle manager's perspective. So
Andy, you're breaking up again. Andy. Okay, so while we wait for Andy's video to come back, I think what you're saying is that the process of working with researchers is important. I think it needs to be both ways, two ways interaction, that the researchers work with the schools and not just on the schools. Okay, I think that's very important. So Andy, you're back. Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. So maybe from the middle manager's perspective is about implementation. How do I lead a department to go with this flow, to work with researchers? Because many teachers might have certain resistance against working with teachers. So maybe Prof. Tan, maybe you can go to the next slide.
Is this the one?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, this is the one. This is the one. So I don't have any fancy framework to present, but perhaps to build on to Mr. Siva's point on design thinking, those of us who are familiar with design thinking might be familiar with this idea of rapid prototyping. So as long as there is a MVP, minimum viable product, that we can dish out, then we can continue with we can roll out the lesson. So how we work with researchers is that, okay, we have the discussion, and then once we have an idea, a lesson idea, a knowledge building lesson idea, we roll it out first and we improve from there. Not everything has to be perfect. Not everything can be perfect. So we just roll it out first. And this is perhaps my mantra for my department. We fail fast, we fail mindfully, and we fail forward. So failing fast means trying out fast. We have a minimum viable product, something that we can roll out. We roll it out first. And we fail mindfully. We review it. We sit down. And if it's a failure, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it and see how we can improve from there. Breaking down the necessary parts, seeing the mechanism of the failure, and then building up from there again, and with the intention of failing forward. So the next lesson, we can learn from it and we can implement it in a quick succession. So actually, if Prof. Tan, you can go back to the previous slide. This example that I shared with regards to the butcher paper is a result of failure. It's a result of failure. So my science team in my school actually met with a huge failure. They started off with knowledge forum first. And at that point, maybe we didn't know better. So we started off with knowledge forum, the technology, without the knowledge building language, without the culture, without the etiquette. And it was a massive failure, catastrophic. Students were posting up everything from profanities all the way to some good ideas, but mostly profanities and other things like that, because they didn't have the knowledge building culture at all. And from there, we learned that we cannot introduce the knowledge forum before we introduce the knowledge building culture. So we started to rack our brains. How can we build a knowledge building culture, knowledge building language before we even touch the computer? And this was born. This fantastic idea was born. So it was born from failure. And as a middle manager, my job is to trust the teachers and to be alongside them, no matter success or failure. And mostly, I can tell you, when we work with innovative pedagogies, it is failure. But ultimately, how can we embrace that and move forward?
Thanks, Andy. Incidentally, there's a question asking about building school culture. I think what you just said answered that question perfectly. So that's very good. And I would like to hear more from maybe Samuel, since you worked in ministry for many years. And what's your take on this? How do we encourage schools, or how do we support schools for innovative pedagogy?
Yeah, thanks. I think from what Melvin and Andy have shared, we can hear something about their the way that they approach, they and their teachers approach designing for learning. So when we think about how do we help teachers to develop as to be adaptive, and flexible in the way that they adjust their teaching action and their overall pedagogical moves that they actually carry out in the classroom. I think Melvin mentioned something earlier about knowledge building and being a principle-based approach to the design. So I guess what he means by that is that knowledge building teachers do put a lot of their base their design on some of the knowledge building principles. Like we think of one that all ideas are improvable, and that we can actually improve or work towards a refined idea that everybody can own. So I think this part about helping schools to sustain their innovative practice, and in this case knowledge building practice, I think one of the key things is to work is to build the structure or the culture for teachers to develop and build on some of their design, some principles in their design, so they can actually innovate as they go forward. So that is opposed to maybe if they follow a set of procedures or steps for designing. So many teachers are actually very adaptable, I think. And I think what we see in schools, and of my observation of teachers, knowledge building teachers, I think they are able to switch and change their pedagogy and work with student ideas in a very adaptive manner. So I guess this is something that would help schools to innovate and to support teachers to sustain some of their practices. So working from designing from principles, and I think Andy's point about this whole idea about failing fast and failing mindfully is a good one. Where teachers actually think about the outcomes of their, what they're actually designing for. The student outcomes that they are reaching for, and how the environment that design, the culture of how they value students' work, students' ideas, students' views, I think is definitely something that schools can and they have considered in many successful stories of schools implementing innovative pedagogy. Yeah.
Thanks, Samuel. I think I hear a few key points here. One is design thinking, design experiments. I think what Mr. Siva and Samuel talked about, they're quite consistent, quite aligned in the sense that a design thinking process of making things work in the classroom, and knowledge building is about design thinking with ideas. So you have two layers here. One is students design thinking with ideas. You have teachers design thinking of how to make this work for the students. And these two are consistent, I think. To me, I think I can hear a lot of all these consistencies among all the different ideas from the panel members. And in the interest of time now, it's about 4:17 according to my clock here. We're moving in and out of the Q&A segment quite seamlessly. And there's a couple other questions that are not answered yet, and one cluster of questions. Sorry if I can't answer all the questions, but one cluster of questions revolves around emotions and learning. So basically, questions like the knowledge forum is not capturing students' emotions. And in LAK conference, there's this big group of interest about using facial expression, for instance. And I know that this group is doing something along that line. So maybe I invite Andy or Julie to talk about some of the things you are working on.
Yeah, I'll just start off. Andy will have some good example to share. So yes, I think the emotional part, the affective part is what we are looking at. So we have started a project called on multimodal learning analytics. The strength of what you see in KF is, first, we also do some sentiment analysis based on what students are writing on KF. So that's important, because even though you don't see emoticon, at one time, one of the version has emoticon, right? And I think we will take what Mr. Siva's design idea seriously in our next version. So, but from the text of the student, you can see how emotionally attached they are to the problem. They will put question mark, they will put capital letter, they will have very nice, they're quite creative in the emoticon in the title. So that's one layer. But we also started looking at students' facial expression, even their EDA, their conductance, their pulse rate, and also their emotional response at each point. So this is one of the latest things that we are doing. It's not easy because the sensing of the emotion manually and through the technology can be quite a gap just to get it to sync and tell us an accurate picture. But one of the key things we have found in our early stage is that the challenge, the emotion of being challenged, the emotion of frustration is actually not as negative as a lot of us think we are. I think earlier there was a talk that don't give up. I mean, Mr. Siva was saying that something about us not giving up. Now, when you see your student getting frustrated and being challenged, I would say that you don't give up as well. I think that's the point that we can relate to as they are going through knowledge building, as they are doing more of constructing knowledge rather than just acquiring a piece of knowledge. They will go through this. But of course, I'm not saying that is the kind of frustration that they give up. But when you have social support in KF and when you are doing a topic that you are emotionally connected to, some of this frustration and challenges has shown students very positive outcome in the notes that they write and in the kind of solution that they are suggesting on KF. So that is actually an area that we are looking at. We are keeping in time. I mean, keeping in pace with the rest of the research. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I don't know whether Andy has anything to add on.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll address it from two perspectives. So one as a teacher and another one maybe from a teacher researcher perspective, because I saw one question which is a fantastic question. This question is asking that maybe KB does not allow for the affective elements normally in social learning to happen, like an expression of enthusiasm, a physical pat on the back to encourage. And I would beg to differ. Actually, I would beg to differ. So my experience as a teacher, why the effective domain to me is quite a big thing. And why ultimately I invested myself in KB is because of the effective domain. So as a teacher, I think a lot of us as teachers, we are concerned about the quieter students in the class, the least vocal students who maybe just do not have the guts, the courage to say, to verbally express themselves. And what I saw every time when we do a lesson on KF, and we go back and we review this with the researchers, many a times the person who turns the tide of the discussion is the quietest student in the whole of the classroom. And my idea is that because maybe he or she tends to listen more than he or she speaks. So maybe the ideas that he or she posits is something that is of a very high quality, and all the ideas gravitate to that, and the tide of discussion is turned. So when as a teacher I highlight this idea, all the students in the class were shocked. This person, but he doesn't talk, she doesn't talk at all. And you can see that student, that quiet student, beaming with pride because his idea or her idea has turned the tide of discussion. And this is not from the teacher's bias. It's based on data. It's based on the analyzing the whole discussion. So knowledge building, especially a knowledge forum, does allow for the democratizing of knowledge, democratizing of ideas. Every student has an equal say in that discussion. And this can lead to a lot of effective outcomes. And maybe from another perspective is maybe from the teacher researcher perspective. So I'm currently looking into the effective aspect of knowledge building, and with regards to two very important emotions, which is curiosity and confusion. Can these emotions, if fostered properly, help in knowledge building? And what we found thus far is really very interesting, because in that setting of knowledge building, actually these emotions come about very vividly. Just to quote maybe a student that we interviewed, that he said in that knowledge building setting, I have never felt so alive. And that is because the problem that we are dealing with matters to him a lot. It's not a textbook question. It's not a 10-year series question. It's a question that he is emotionally invested in. And therefore that curiosity comes through via when we interviewed him, I've never felt so alive. And that student was actually a very quiet student. And when he said that, I just felt that, this is the effective aspect of knowledge building coming forth. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. Now it's about 4:24 with 5 minutes left. I think we can have one more question just going to point out this question here that we get asked very often. How do teachers accommodate students' learning requests? Okay, their questions, what they want to explore, while we still need to complete the syllabus. I'm quite sure Melvin, Julie, Andy, Mr. Siva.
I just want to add on one question that's related. There's one more question that says that if our school assessment does not support knowledge building, it'll probably go nowhere. And just asking for some comment. I thought it's related, so I'll let.
Sure, yes. So anyone want to talk about that?
Make a quick I think this is something asked by teachers all the time, that sometimes, you know, you want us to do innovative things in the classroom, but then what about student, you know, the syllabus to be covered? What about these things? I think sometimes we use also the word innovative practice as if it is beyond reach, or kind of like something that is good to do. But I think if we take a look at where the environment that our students are in and where they are heading towards, the world where the world is heading to, I think some of these practices that we want to put in the class are no more a good to have. They're actually, we really think about it, they are the must-haves of really bringing students to the, you know, to acquire the 21st century skills that we want them to have. So I think one of the things to think about is that they are not necessarily always beyond reach of good to haves. I think if we think of them as must-haves, we will accommodate them in our, or design them as part of our learning process in the classroom per se. I think that's one way to think about the thing. The other part, if I can make a quick mention about effect in the classroom, you know, the effective domain of learning. I think while we are talking about KF, you know, there's this critique, right? Or does this have that or not? But I think we've got to situate KF within a larger context of blended learning, where the social interactions in the class, especially for kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, and all, they are still relevant. So it is not totally online learning, which is virtual learning, but I think it is blended with when they do see their friend in school, you know, but this is another way, an addition to that social interaction that they have. So they can still have that physical pat on the shoulder, you know, the star in the class, and all of those things. So I think it is not a one or the other, but I think it's within that continuum of blended learning. Yep.
Thanks, Mr. Siva. I think this brings us to the important ideas that we are exploring in Singapore: blended learning, personal learning devices, self-directed learning, collaborative learning. So we're not talking about knowledge building as if this is the only pedagogy. We're saying that this is one of the examples in which we can try out and to see all these different ideas come together and not as separate policies or separate initiatives. I think that's the key idea that we're trying to bring across. So definitely, we're not saying that knowledge building is the only way, but this is one of the ways in which we have seen it work in schools and to tackle several problems together. I think, Melvin, you want to say something about covering the syllabus?
Yeah, allow me a bit on the two different questions accordingly. I think a bit earlier, what Andy and Mr. Siva mentioned, the effective portion itself. I think right now I'm doing my own research, mini research together with my team. Okay, we really realized that through the knowledge building culture itself, it really builds students' self-efficacy, and it also eventually the idea of positivity. Okay, I think it's very interesting, the outcomes from there. It really relates to the idea of effective domain. I think secondly, in terms of syllabus, in terms of covering syllabus, that's certainly a concern for most of us, or basically all of us. Okay, I think one thing we can be assured of is you always go beyond the syllabus. Okay, I've been trying out for at least 7 to 8 years with Dr. Teo and the team itself. It always go beyond syllabus by itself. For example, I mentioned earlier the shopping bag, maybe the idea of the shopping bag. If you take a look at the shopping bag itself, it's not, you realize that you connect to a topic on propaganda, you will connect to a topic on kind of personality, acting accordingly. Same thing for hairstyle, the idea of haircut. It will connect to secret societies. in Singapore in the British rule, you connect to external links with China, and also idea of a status, okay, in whether you're rich or you may not be so rich accordingly. So every single student's interest itself can connect topics. That's where that's the reason I mentioned earlier. We need to be well versed in terms of subject disciplinarity and the willingness to come together with a community of practitioners to discuss and to refine our understanding of the entire topic itself. Yeah.
Thanks, Melvin. In the interest of time, I'm afraid we can't continue this very interesting discussion. I do have one more video to show you, very short video clips. This is from Professor Marlene Scardamalia, one of the pioneers of knowledge building pedagogies, as well as knowledge forum technology. And I think she's working on this big cross-nation projects. So doing a little bit of advertisement here to invite you if you're interested to participate in this. So allow me to share screen with you on this, but I do not know how. Okay, hold on. Okay.
Idea that ideas are a plentiful natural resource with great potential to improve the health and wealth of nations. And unfortunately, unlike other natural resources, they don't get used up, but can be increased endlessly and improved endlessly. So knowledge building is a research-based educational approach that gives students a role in this creative process. It engages students directly in the means by which knowledge is advanced in the world. The evidence we have at this point shows that creative collaborative work with ideas previously reserved for a few can be a normal and central part of education at all levels, at all students. In addition to students as idea creators, not just acquirers or users of others' ideas, students' ideas can be on trajectories that intersect with ideas of communities working at the cutting edge of their field. And that's what I would like to try to give you some sense of how we are trying to accomplish that in some new work with this design experiment. So engaging the global community requires ideas rising and advancing through a coherent public layer of work. That's how we get to this challenge expressed on the right here of ideas at the intersect of global distributed communities. So the idea here is that ideas from local communities will help advance ideas and discoveries. And teams of scientists, researchers, and engineers will help demonstrate the power of our collective work. Overall, the research program that we are striving for, then the orange bar would be our design experiment. We want to show that on these things that are really fundamental to the concerns of schools, curriculum expectations, distance learning, family and community. I haven't talked about that and how families and broader communities might be more engaged, but issues of inquiry learning, student agency. The goal is to collectively in a global experiment show that we can indeed address these issues and we can make these kinds of advances. So pre-post, like before they're engaged in such work and after they are engaged in such work, what are the kinds of advances? So again, this is not an actual graph of what we have done. It's a dreamed of graph of what we will do as a global community working together. So designing the design experiment is the challenge. I've given you some sense of what kinds of issues we can tackle. I've tried to give you some sense of how students' ideas on the trajectory to saving the planet, saving lives, actually can be brought home to them in a more, in a clear way, because their ideas are literally on the trajectory. So what we're imagining is these knowledge building communities around the world coming together to create the kind of research profile that I've just shown. And in closing, I just want to say some of the things like where we have started a webinar series. And so if any site see themselves as possibly interested, we can design these webinars, have examples from people who are engaged, also people who wish to be engaged. We have not yet created the public layer at each participating sites. There are obviously all kinds of issues about ethics in how you can deal with data from different sites. But one thing is we can deal with completely anonymized data so that we have substantial protections on the privacy of any students who might be engaged. So we actually think that this is really quite feasible. The explorations with analytics to get to cutting edge ideas, I've given you some sense of how we're starting, and that, of course, we expect to need to be advanced considerably with time. There's also the issue about notification to local communities. We can be doing this work, we can find these trajectories, but how do students and teachers themselves find out about that and become engaged? And again, we're engaged in explorations of that and building the kinds of libraries of discourse from the different sites. So if you're interested, I've given you a contact person who can help connect you with the broader team. And I would love to have any of your questions or thoughts or insights about our design experiment.
Thank you very much. And audience, I think, thanks for your active participation. What we're seeing here is actually idea improvement, building on to idea. We can see many questions still there. Unfortunately, we can't answer all the questions, but I think this is a very good demonstration of idea improvement in work. And thank you very much for spending this afternoon with us. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of the participants and audience, I'd like to thank the panel members for taking their precious time off to share with us their experience and their view about innovative pedagogies beyond just learning. Thank you.